Hi folks, we recently had a question from someone who works in a scene shop at a theater and was wondering about using SU Podium to add realism to their stage designs. The question said, I'm looking to take our stage and event designs to the next level using rendering software to bring the feel of realism rather than just a computer drawing. One of our big needs is to be able to add theater lighting into the designs, and this is not the easiest thing to do in SketchUp. Will this software be able to provide for this need? Now, the answer to that is definitely yes, and I've answered similar questions from scenic designers before, so I thought this would be a great opportunity for a short lighting demo. I asked whether he had a model he'd be willing to share for a demo, and he was kind enough to send us this SketchUp file to work with. So this won't be a super detailed tutorial, but my goal is to show the basic process to take a stage design in SketchUp and make it a little bit more realistic with SU Podium. Alright, so starting from this point with a relatively finished SketchUp file, the general rendering workflow can be broken down into 5 parts. First, we're going to finish prepping the model for rendering, then we're going to establish an ambient light level, we'll add our theatrical lighting, tweak the material settings, and set up some basic podium materials, and then finally I'll go through some render settings for efficient test rendering and iterating on ideas, and I'll also provide some recommended settings for a finished image. And all this is going to be timestamped beneath the video. It shouldn't be that long, but that way you can jump to individual sections if you need to. Alright, so I've got the model open, and as you can see, it's very nicely done and quite detailed. In addition to the scenic design, he's included the stage, proscenium, curtains, and some seating, which is fantastic. All these extra elements provide a lot of context for the design and will just make it that much easier to get a realistic render from this SketchUp file. He's even included the entire fly tower and some alternate background options. So this is a much better approach than just taking your scene and sticking it in an empty SketchUp file and trying to get a render without any surroundings at all. If we put the design in realistic surroundings and take the time to model the stage and environment, you're going to end up with much better results in the long run. And the nice thing about the stage is that you only need to model it once. Once you have it, you can just reuse it for all your future productions. Okay, to get this ready for rendering, there's only one small alteration that I want to make to the model, essentially because I want to control what portion of the sky is visible to the camera. So the problem is that in the upper left and the upper right here, there are 2 sections where the sky is visible behind the stage, and obviously in an actual indoor theater that would never be the case. So what I did was modified the walls around the stage so that the structure extends up and around the fly tower and sort of caps off the space. So if we look back down here from this ground level perspective, you can see those 2 spots where the sky was poking through are now blocked off. Alright, the next thing I want to do is set up a quick camera angle and save it as a SketchUp scene. This way we have a composition that we can easily return to. So I'll just click the front camera view, and that's going to reset the tilt of the camera and give us a nice clean orthographic perspective. Then I can just bring the camera height down to something that feels natural. I'm also going to zoom in pretty close to the front here, and I want to change the field of view so that the view is a little bit more compressed. I want to use a longer focal length, so I go to Camera, Field of View, and instead of 40 millimeters, I decided something like 55 millimeters would look good, so just type 55 mm and hit Enter, and you can see that appears to zoom us out, but what it actually did was compress the field of view. So now I can zoom in to right about here, and I just want to see a slight hint of the first couple rows of chairs. So I think this is a pretty good view where we're at. Maybe I can bring the eye height up just a little bit and make sure we're centered. If you do want to fine-tune the camera, you can always use the walk. Click on a reference point, and then you can very slowly slide in and out, forward, backward, up and down. But I think that's pretty good right there. So I'm going to save this as a render cam. I'll just click the plus button in the scenes tray. That's going to create a new scene, and then I'm going to rename that render camera. Alright, so now if I move the camera while I'm working, I can always press the render camera scene to go right back to that composition that I liked. Alright, let's work on setting up the ambient light levels in the render. Now, in just about any other type of architectural visualization, an interior space usually needs to be fully enclosed, and this is so we can control the exposure of the render and make sure sunlight is only entering the space through windows like it would in the real world. Now, because the interior of a theater is so dark, we can actually get away with some shortcuts and not spend any more time worrying about the walls and structure around the stage. Because the sun is a non-factor, we're not even going to turn it on. And then what we're going to do instead is set the entire background to a very dark shade, just a little bit above black, and we're going to use that to establish our ambient light level. Now, there are videos in the Getting Started playlist that talk about this in greater detail, but one very important concept to understand with regard to SU Podium is that the environment itself acts as a source of ambient light. So even if the sun and shadows are not turned on, the model is still going to be illuminated by some diffuse ambient light from the sky around the model. And what that means is that the overall brightness of our render is going to depend very heavily on the brightness of the environment around our model. And as you can see, this light gray background and environment are just far too bright to accurately simulate the inside of a theater. So the first thing I want to do is come up to the Podium Options menu by clicking the gear icon. Switch to the Environment tab and make sure under Background you have Default Set in SketchUp selected. What this means is that SU Podium is going to use the background color in the SketchUp viewport as the background and sky in the Podium render. So anytime you want to set the color of the background manually, you want to make sure Default Set in SketchUp is selected. There's a couple other background options, but I'm not going to go through them in this video. But if you want to learn more about the background options, there is a video in the SU Podium version 2.6 Getting Started playlist. Okay, so with Default Set in SketchUp selected, I'm going to click Save and close the Options dialog. And before we move on, I just want to make a render with the light gray background to show you why it doesn't really work for a theater scene. So I'm going to go back into that camera view and press the render button, and I'll pause the video for 1 second. Alright, this test render finished in about 2 minutes and 15 seconds, and it should be pretty obvious right off the bat that this is just far too bright. There's way too much light hitting the chairs and the foreground here. The lighting is really flat and diffuse. It's almost like every light in the auditorium is turned on, where in reality, during a performance, the theater should be almost completely devoid of light except for the stage lighting. So what we want to do is set the sky to a much darker color, and you're going to see how much influence that has on the render in just a second. So what we'll do is come over to the Styles tray. And in the Styles menu, there's a drop down and you can choose Podium. And this gives us a few options for darker skies. We can do Twilight, which I think is going to be a little bit too bright for this, actually. Then there's Night 1 and Dark Night. Dark Night is actually completely black. And this is going to be too dark because if the sky is completely dark, completely black, and there's no other light source in the model, we're not going to have any light in the scene at all. So Night 1 is actually a color that's just slightly above black, and I think that's what we're going to want to use. So I want to go back to the render cam, make sure Night 1 is selected, and I'm going to take another test render. Alright, so this is what the render looks like with just that small amount of ambient light from the dark background. It's not 100% black. We can still make out the things on the stage here, and we can see the chairs in the foreground. But this is very close to what you would expect from the inside of a theater before any of the lights are turned on. And this is going to be a great base that we can build the rest of our lighting from. Now, one thing I do want to note is that if you thought the ambient light level was a little bit too dark or even a little bit too bright, you can fine-tune that by changing the background color in the Podium style. So in order to do that, all you need to do is scroll down to the Styles section, flip into the Edit tab, and then make sure you have background settings selected, which is the middle icon in this row of 5 icons. Then you just need to click the background swatch, and that's going to bring up a color picker, so you can make the background brighter, darker, change the saturation value, or give it a different hue. But in this case, I want exactly what I had before, so I'm just going to go back to that render cam, and that was a blackness value of 9 and a saturation of 41. So it's just got a little bit of blue in it, and it's almost entirely black. All right, so that's how we get to this point right here. And now in the next section, we're going to start adding some theatrical lighting to the stage. All right, let's jump right into adding some lighting to the set. So just a real quick rundown. SU Podium has 3 different artificial light types. Omni lights, which are like a light bulb and cast light in all directions. Spotlights, which cast a directional cone-shaped beam and let you assign a target and light radius. And then light emitting materials, which lets you assign light emitting properties to any surface in your model. So anytime you need something to glow, like a large diffuse panel or a neon sign, you can use a light emitting material. All right, so those are the tools that we have at our disposal. I want this video to be a practical demonstration rather than a detailed lighting introduction, so if you're new to SU Podium, you should head over to the Getting Started playlist and watch the artificial lighting videos after you finish this one. But let's get back to the stage. Okay, now I'm not sure what the original vision was for the lighting of this set, so I'm going to keep it pretty simple and just do a spotlight shining down on the stage, and then a couple of colored lights to illuminate the backdrop. And we'll see how it looks from there. So to place a spotlight, we open the Podium Light System dialog by clicking the light bulb icon. Under Light Type, I want to select Spotlight, but before we hit Create, we need to choose the color and intensity. So instead of using a pure white light, I think I'm going to give it just a tiny bit of warmth. So I'm going to slide this up here and over here. We'll select a color. And you can see the color preview right in the window there. I think right about there is going to be good, so I'll click OK. Now, for the light power value, it's sort of a matter of trial and error. For a regular small-scale architectural interior, usually something between 1 and 5 is going to be perfectly fine. However, this is a large-scale set, and the light is actually going to be quite far from any of the elements, so we're going to need to use something a lot higher. I'm just going to start with something like 30 right off the bat, and then we can do some test renders, and if it needs to be increased or decreased, we can do that later. The last set of parameters is the beam angle. So the outer cone controls the radius of the spotlight, and the inner cone controls the light fall off. If you wanted a really broad spotlight that covers most of the stage, you could use a really wide value for the outer cone and then a relatively low value for the inner cone, and that would give you a nice wide spotlight with a relatively soft edge. If you wanted a tighter, smaller spotlight, you could reduce both of these values and make the sliders closer together. The closer the inner cone is to the outer cone, the harder the edge of the spotlight is going to be. So if you need like a really narrow follow spot or something like that, you could maybe use something like 10 and 15 for these two values, and that'll give you a nice focused spotlight that can isolate a single subject. But in this case, I want to illuminate most of the stage, so I'm going to go back to an outer cone of 45 and keep this right here at 15. And then I'm going to click Create to place the spotlight. So let me move that out of the way, zoom in a little bit, and placing a spotlight is going to take 3 clicks. I click Create. Then we need to choose an inference point on the stage. That's the first click. So I'm going to say right here looks pretty good. The second click, we can slide the light along any axis. I want to go straight up, so it's up here, sort of where a spotlight would normally be hanging in an auditorium. Second click finalizes the height, and then the third click, we're going to choose where we want the spotlight to be aimed. In this case, I actually just want it to shine right down in the middle of this stage area. So I'm hoping this entire broad area of stage is going to be illuminated. So I'm going to sort of pick a point right in the center. Right there looks good, and that's going to finalize the placement of the spotlight. I'm going to close the light system window and go back to the render cam, and then I'm going to make a quick test render. All right, this was the result of that first test render, and there were 2 things that I didn't like about it right off the bat. The first is that my aim was a little bit off with the spotlight. I meant for it mostly to be illuminating the stage, but it ended up being angled so that a lot of the light was hitting the backdrop. So what I did was went in and replaced that spotlight with another one that was shining straight down. So I moved it a little bit further toward the front of the stage and then went straight up with it and then pointed it directly down. Okay, that was the first change. And the second thing that I didn't like was that I think there's a little bit too much light on the foreground. And that, again, comes from the sky color. So what I did was went into the Podium background settings. And remember, this was at 9 before. I just reduced the blackness value all the way down to 3. And what we ended up with was this. So the foreground gets darker. We can still sort of see the chairs, but not nearly as much. And obviously this spotlight is shining straight down onto the stage instead of hitting the backdrop. We're going to put some different lights on the backdrop, which is why I wanted to redo that spotlight. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and place the other 2 spotlights now. Alright, so I want to place 3 more lights to finish off the example, and I've already placed a couple of guides in the model to roughly show where I want the lights to be, so I'm just going to hide this backdrop to make it a little bit easier to see. And let's open up the Podium light system window, and I'm going to put 2 spotlights on the left side here, and then an Omni light down here on the stage. So for the spotlights, I've already worked out the values that I want. I'm going to go with a light power of 15, an inner cone of 15, and an outer cone of 55. And for the color, I'm just using a saturated blue. The RGB values are 31, 45, 220. So I'll click Create, and now I need 3 clicks to place the light. Choose an inference point. Choose the height that I want it, which was roughly right up here. And then I want to aim it right here at the door, just dead center. Okay, so that spotlight is taken care of. For the second one, I'm using a slightly lower light power, so I'm going to go with 10. The outer cone is 60 this time, and the inner cone is 15. And this one is going to be more of a magenta, so 232, 30, 116. Click OK, click Create, and this time, nope, we still need the inference. So right here, click at roughly the height of that guide was right here. And then this one I just aimed, again, pretty much dead center on the center section. Okay, I'm going to switch the Podium light system to Omni light, and this time I'm just going with a light power of 6, and this is going to be a cool blue shade. So 147 under red, 158, 210. Click OK, and now we can place the final light right here and about this height. Okay, so close the light system window and let me show you what that looks like now. Okay, for the test render, I'm going to go back to the render cam. And I did move the camera forward just a little bit to make this a little bit larger in the frame. I'm going to open up my SU Podium render settings and just run through the settings I'm using for these quick test renders. So under image size, I have viewport selected. That means SU Podium is going to render the image at the exact resolution of the SketchUp viewport. So exactly the size that you see here on the screen is what the render is going to be. Rendering at the size of the viewport is usually a pretty good option for test rendering because it tends to get done pretty quickly as long as you don't have a super high resolution display. If you're on a Mac with a Retina display or you're using a 4K monitor, you might not want to use viewport for test renders because all that extra resolution is going to make the images take a lot longer to render. So if that's the case and you have an SU Podium license, what you would want to do is select fixed and use something smaller than your screen. Because if you're on a Retina display, your resolution is probably something like 3076 by 2034 or even higher if you're on a 4K monitor. So in that case, you would just want to drop it down to like 1024 by 768 for your test renders. And that will prevent the images from taking, 20 or 30 minutes just for a simple quick test render. But I'm going to go back to viewport because on my machine that only takes about 2 to 5 minutes, so it's a good choice. Okay, for my image format, I'm using PNG, and for my preset, I'm using the interior default preset. There's a lot to be said about presets, and I think it's beyond the scope of this short video, so if you're new to Podium, just check out the Getting Started playlist and watch the entire video on presets. But for now, select interior default, and under environment, we went over this earlier, I'm using default set in SketchUp. I just have the intensity and exposure set at their mid values, and I do have soft Omni checked. It slows down the render a little bit, but it means the Omni lights cast softer shadows than they would if this was unchecked. So interior default, default background, intensity and exposure at 50-50, and we're all set. So I'm going to click Save, Render, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. Alright, so here's the result of the render, and as you can see, this set is really starting to come to life. I'm not going to take the lighting any further than this because I really just wanted to give you an idea of how you can start building up some basic lighting in SU Podium, but of course, it's up to your imagination to push it further than this. There's tons of things you could do, like adding lights to these cubes in the middle here. If you had actors and actresses on the stage, you probably would have more intense spotlights illuminating the players. The options are endless. The only other thing I want to talk about real quick is material properties. So right now, there aren't any SU Podium material properties on this model, but I'm just going to really quickly show you what we can do to make the stage surface a little bit more realistic. I'm going to give it a blurred reflection and show you what that looks like. So let me minimize this and open the SU Podium material properties dialog, grab the eyedropper, color pick the stage, and right now there's no material properties on this. It's just 100% diffuse. What I'm going to do is give it a 20% reflection and check the blurred reflection checkbox so that it's not a sharp mirror-like reflection, and then click apply. And then if I render it one more time, this is what we get. So as you can see, that stage surface starts to feel a lot more lifelike. Most of the time, the surface of a stage is going to have just a little bit of subtle reflection on it. You're not going to have a completely diffuse, flat surface. This is much more true to life. We're seeing reflections of the red and the blues here, and the lights over here. So we're starting to get a much more lifelike result. There's a lot more information about materials in the SU Podium Getting Started series, so I do recommend you watch the materials video and learn a little bit more about all the different properties in this material properties interface. Okay, I think that's going to do it for this example. That should be enough to get you started and give you a basic framework to create this kind of render. As I mentioned several times throughout the video, there is a Getting Started playlist, so I'll link to those videos that I mentioned in the comments beneath the video. Okay, there's just one more feature I want to mention before I end the video, and that's the Podium Browser content library. So SU Podium comes with an extensive library of materials and SketchUp components that you can download directly into your model. Now, this isn't necessarily going to be super useful for a set like this where you're doing a historical themed production, but if you're doing a more modern set design, let's say we're doing a diner, for example, the Podium Browser library can be really useful for set dressing, minor props, anything that you just need to quickly throw into a design to make it feel a little bit more lifelike, but you don't want to spend modeling, like coffee cups, condiments, that sort of thing. So Podium Browser is a lot like the 3D Warehouse in the sense that you can just search through all these categories, find what you need, and download it right into your scene. So for this diner, for example, we might want some table accessories. So I can type in napkin, and we'll find this napkin holder. I just click the download icon and place it right on the table. What else do we want? Condiments, download. And let's say we're not sure what we want and we just want to search through. I can come down to, let's say, dining accessories. I'll click see all. And right here we've got things like bowls. A coffee mug would look good, so I'll download that, place that onto the table. Maybe we'll get this one as well. This person drank theirs quickly and has already finished. And let's see if we can find some food. So maybe under kitchen, accessories, and let's go with this cheeseburger. Download that. And you can see how quickly and easily this diner scene comes together without us having to search the internet for 3D models or even spend the time modeling them ourselves. So Podium Browser is a really great resource for more modern style sets, not just kitchen stuff. There's over 20 categories on the left-hand column here. If you need furniture, bedroom, dining, living. There's even pre-made assemblies, although I assume most of the time for set design, you're going to be designing most of the major stuff yourselves, but Podium Browser will be really useful for smaller props and set dressing. So I just wanted to draw your attention to that resource. Most of it is locked unless you have an SU Podium license, but there are about 800 free components and SketchUp materials. All right, so that's going to wrap up the video. I hope you guys learned something, and learned a little bit about how to make a dark theater style render and add some lighting to a set design. So if you have any questions, you can email us at support@cataloginc.com or let us know on the forums or even in the comments beneath the video. So have a great one and see you in the next one.